I woke up at 6:30 that Tuesday morning to the sound of snowplows scraping against asphalt, a noise that always reminded me of nails on a chalkboard, but somehow felt comforting in the dead of winter. My apartment in Boulder, Colorado had a perfect view of the parking lot, and I could see the white blanket that had accumulated overnight, probably 8 or 9 inches by my estimate. I stretched, made myself a cup of coffee, and got ready for my work-from-home day, grateful that I didn't have to venture out into the mess. My name is Michael Irving, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Heights community for about 2 years. It was one of those newer developments with identical townhouses, manicured lawns in the summer, and a homeowners association that seemed to exist solely to make everyone's life slightly more difficult. The HOA was run by a woman named Patricia Henderson, a 50-something blonde with perfectly maintained highlights and an attitude that suggested she had never been told no in her entire life. She had 2 lieutenants who followed her around like disciples, agreeing with everything she said and enforcing rules with the enthusiasm of mall cops who finally got a taste of authority. I had parked my car in my designated spot the night before, a silver Honda Accord that I had bought used but kept in pristine condition. The spot was directly in front of my unit, number 42, and I had every right to park there. I paid my HOA fees on time, followed the community guidelines, and generally kept to myself. I wasn't the type to cause trouble or draw attention. Around 9 in the morning, I was in the middle of a video conference call with my team when I happened to glance out the window. My parking spot was empty. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things wrong, but no, the space where my car had been was just a rectangle of cleared asphalt surrounded by snow. My heart started pounding as I muted my microphone and stood up, pressing my face against the cold glass to get a better look. Gone. My car was completely gone. I unmuted quickly. "Hey guys, I'm really sorry, but I have an emergency. I need to drop off this call." I didn't wait for responses before closing my laptop and grabbing my phone. My first thought was that it had been stolen, which seemed crazy in broad daylight in a neighborhood like this, but what other explanation was there? I threw on my winter coat, boots, and hat, then rushed outside into the biting cold. The snow was still falling lightly, and I could see tire tracks leading out of the parking lot, but they were already being covered by fresh powder. I walked around the entire complex, thinking maybe I had somehow forgotten where I parked, even though I knew that was ridiculous. After 20 minutes of searching and getting increasingly wet and cold, I went back inside and called the Boulder Police Department non-emergency line. The dispatcher was polite but not particularly helpful. "Have you checked with your HOA? Sometimes they arrange towing for violations." "Violations? What violations? I parked in my assigned spot." "I understand, sir, but you might want to check with them first." If it was towed by the HOA, it would be at whatever impound lot they contract with. I thanked her and hung up, already feeling my blood pressure rising. I pulled up the contact information for the HOA management office and dialed. It rang 6 times before someone picked up. "Meadowbrook Heights HOA, this is Deborah speaking." "Hi Deborah, this is Michael Irving from Unit 42. My car is missing from my parking spot and I'm trying to figure out what happened to it." There was a pause, some clicking of a keyboard. "Oh yes, Mr. Irving. Your vehicle was towed this morning at approximately 7:15. I felt my jaw clench. Towed? Why would it be towed? I was parked in my assigned spot. Due to the snow emergency parking ban, all vehicles were required to be moved to allow for proper snow removal. Your vehicle was in violation. Snow emergency parking ban. I never received any notice about that. More keyboard clicking. The notice was posted on the community website yesterday evening at 8 p.m. and sent via email to all residents. I pulled up my email on my phone while still holding it to my ear, scrolling through. I don't have any email from the HOA. Well, it was sent to the email address we have on file for you. Which is what? She read off an email address that was definitely not mine. It was close, but had an extra character in it, like someone had made a typo when entering it into the system. I pointed this out to her. I'm sorry, Mr. Irving, but we can only work with the information provided to us. The notice was also posted on the website and on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. So you're telling me that I was supposed to check the website and walk to the mailboxes in a snowstorm to see if there might be a parking ban? We expect all residents to stay informed about community policies and emergency notifications. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. Where is my car now? It's been taken to Rocky Mountain Towing on Walnut Street. You'll need to contact them directly to arrange retrieval. There will be towing and storage fees. How much? That's between you and the towing company, Mr. Irving. This is absolutely ridiculous. I want to speak to Patricia Henderson. Mrs. Henderson is not available at the moment. You can request a hearing with the HOA board if you wish to dispute the towing. You bet I'm going to dispute it. How do I request a hearing? You'll need to submit a written request within 30 days. The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. I hung up without saying goodbye, which wasn't like me, but I was too angry to maintain pleasantries. 3 weeks. My car was sitting in an impound lot racking up fees, and I had to wait 3 weeks to even present my case. I called Rocky Mountain Towing next. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. Yeah, Rocky Mountain. Hi, I'm calling about my car. It was towed from Meadowbrook Heights this morning. Make and model, Honda Accord Silver 2019. Yeah, we got it. You coming to pick it up? How much is it going to cost me? Towing fee is $250 plus $85 per day storage. So if you pick it up today, that's $335. $335. Are you kidding me? Plus tax. That's our rate. I didn't do anything wrong. My HOA towed it without proper notice. Not my problem, man. You want your car, that's what it costs. I felt defeated, but I needed my car. I had appointments later in the week and errands to run. Fine, I'll be there in an hour. Bring your license, registration, and payment, cash or card. The towing company was about 4 miles away, which meant I had to call an Uber in the snow. The driver, a friendly guy named Ahmed, made small talk about the weather while I stewed in the back seat, thinking about how much this day was costing me. The Uber was $23. At the impound lot, I paid the extortionate fee with my credit card, signed a bunch of paperwork, and finally got my car back. As I drove home, carefully navigating the snowy roads, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just roll over and accept this. What the HOA had done was wrong, and I was going to fight it. When I got back to my townhouse, I parked in my spot, noting that the snow removal they had supposedly needed to do was minimal at best. The parking lot had been plowed, sure, but it didn't look like they had done anything that required every single car to be moved. I went inside, changed into dry clothes, and started doing research. I spent the next several hours reading through Colorado HOA laws, tenant rights, and towing regulations. I learned that HOAs do have the right to tow vehicles in certain circumstances, but they must provide proper notice. The definition of proper notice varies, but generally, it requires either direct communication to the homeowner or posting in a manner that residents would reasonably see. An email to the wrong address and a post on a website didn't seem to meet that threshold, especially for an emergency implemented with less than 12 hours notice. I also found out that I could take the HOA to small claims court if the board hearing didn't resolve the issue. The filing fee was minimal, and I could represent myself. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of my email, photographing my parking spot, printing out the HOA bylaws and Colorado statutes that seemed relevant. The next day, I drafted a formal complaint letter to the HOA board. I explained the situation clearly and unemotionally, cited the relevant laws, and requested a full refund of the towing and storage fees, plus my Uber costs. I also requested that they correct my email address in their system and implement better notice procedures for future emergencies. I sent it via certified mail so I would have proof of delivery. A week went by with no response. I followed up with a phone call and was told that my letter had been received and would be addressed at the next board meeting. I confirmed that I would be attending the meeting to present my case in person. Finally, the evening of the board meeting arrived. It was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the pool that was used for events and meetings. I arrived 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation, dressed in business casual attire to make a good impression. The room had about 30 folding chairs set up facing a long table where the board members would sit. A few other residents were already there, chatting quietly among themselves. Patricia Henderson arrived exactly on time, sweeping into the room like she owned it. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Behind her were the other board members. Frank Walters, a retired accountant who always looked slightly confused, and Susan Morrison, a real estate agent who spent most of her time checking her phone. Patricia took her seat at the center of the table and banged a gavel unnecessarily hard. This meeting of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA board will now come to order. We have several items on the agenda tonight. First, we'll discuss the landscaping contract renewal, then the pool maintenance budget, and finally, we have a dispute hearing for Unit 42. I sat through 45 minutes of mind-numbing discussion about mulch types and chlorine costs, my leg bouncing with impatience. Finally, Patricia looked up from her notes and called my name. Michael Irving, Unit 42, regarding the vehicle towing incident. Please come forward and state your case. I stood and walked to the front of the room, setting my folder on a small podium that had been set up. Thank you for hearing me tonight. On January 14th, my vehicle was towed from my assigned parking spot without proper notice. The HOA claims that notice was provided via email and on the website, but the email was sent to an incorrect address, and I had no reasonable way of knowing about the website post given that it was made less than 12 hours before the supposed ban went into effect. Patricia interrupted me. Mr. Irving, it is every homeowner's responsibility to ensure that their contact information is current and to stay informed about community policies. I provided the correct email when I moved in 2 years ago. If there was an error in transcription, that's not my fault. Furthermore, even if the email had been correct, 12 hours is not reasonable notice for an emergency parking ban, especially one that goes into effect in the middle of the night. I had no way of knowing I needed to move my car. The snow was forecasted days in advance, Susan Morrison chimed in, still looking at her phone. Everyone knew it was coming. Knowing that snow is coming is not the same as knowing there would be a parking ban, I countered. In the 2 years I've lived here, we've had plenty of snowstorms and there has never been a parking ban before. How was I supposed to anticipate this? Patricia's expression tightened. The board has the authority to implement emergency measures as needed for the safety and maintenance of the community. I'm not disputing your authority to implement measures. I'm disputing the lack of proper notice. According to Colorado Revised Statutes Title 38, Article 33.3, and also according to our own HOA bylaws, homeowners must be given reasonable notice of rule changes or emergency actions that affect their property rights. An email to the wrong address and a website post do not constitute reasonable notice. I pulled out printed copies of the relevant statutes and bylaws and handed them to each board member. Patricia barely glanced at them. "Mr. Irving, we sent out the notice through our established channels. We can't be responsible if individual homeowners don't receive them. You can be responsible if the reason I didn't receive it is because your office put the wrong email address in the system. I've brought proof of the email I provided on my original application." I handed over another document showing my move in paperwork, with my correct email clearly written. Frank Walters actually looked at the documents I had provided, flipping between the pages with a furrowed brow. "Patricia, it does seem like the email address is different." "That's a clerical error at most," Patricia said dismissively. "It doesn't change the fact that Mr. Irving's vehicle was in violation of the parking ban. A clerical error that cost me $335 in towing and storage fees, plus $23 for an Uber. I'm requesting a full refund of those costs and a written apology for the improper towing." Patricia actually laughed at that. "We're not going to reimburse you for the consequences of your own failure to stay informed, Mr. Irving. The towing was done in accordance with our community rules." "Then I'll see you in court," I said, keeping my voice level, "because those rules require proper notice which was not provided." The room went very quiet. Patricia's face flushed red. "Are you threatening this board?" "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm informing you that if you don't resolve this matter appropriately, I will file a claim in small claims court. I have all the documentation I need to prove that proper notice was not given." Patricia glanced at the other board members, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. Frank was still studying the papers I had given him, and Susan had finally put down her phone. "The board will take your complaint under advisement," Patricia said stiffly. "We'll provide you with a written response within 10 business days." "That's all I'm asking for," I said. "A fair review of the facts." I gathered my papers and returned to my seat, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had never been the type to confront authority or make waves, but something about the casual dismissal of my concerns had ignited something in me. The rest of the meeting wrapped up quickly, and as people filed out, a few neighbors approached me quietly. "Good for you," an older man said, shaking my hand. "Patricia has been on a power trip for years. Someone needs to stand up to her." A woman in her 30s nodded. "She towed my car last year for being 3 inches over the parking line. Cost me $200, and when I complained, she threatened to fine me for harassment." I thanked them and headed home, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. I meant what I had said about going to court, but I hoped it wouldn't come to that. A court case, even a small claims case, would be time-consuming and stressful. 10 business days came and went with no response from the HOA. I waited an additional 3 days to be generous. Then I started preparing my small claims court filing. The process was surprisingly straightforward. I went to the Boulder County Courthouse, filled out the paperwork, paid the $75 filing fee, and submitted everything to the clerk. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, which gave everyone time to prepare. The HOA was served with the lawsuit papers a week later. Within 24 hours, I received a phone call from a lawyer named Richard Green, who identified himself as counsel for Meadowbrook Heights HOA. "Mr. Irving, I'm calling regarding the small claims action you filed against my client. I'd like to discuss the possibility of settling this matter without going to court. I'm listening, I said cautiously. My client is willing to refund half of the towing and storage fees as a gesture of goodwill, without any admission of wrongdoing. That's not acceptable. I want a full refund, including the Uber costs and a written acknowledgement that proper notice was not provided. Mr. Irving, you have to understand that HOAs have broad authority to manage their communities. This case is not as clear-cut as you seem to think. Then I guess we'll let the judge decide. I'm confident in my case. There was a pause. Let me discuss this with my client and get back to you. You have until 5 business days before the court date. After that, I'm not interested in settling. I hung up feeling pretty good about myself. Having an actual lawyer get involved meant the HOA was taking this seriously, which meant I probably had a strong case. 3 weeks later, 2 weeks before the scheduled court date, Richard Green called back. Mr. Irving, my client has authorized me to offer a full refund of the towing and storage fees, $335. They're also willing to correct your email address in their system and implement a new policy requiring 24 hours notice for parking bans. What about the Uber costs and the written acknowledgement? They'll include the Uber costs, $23, correct? But they won't provide any written statement that could be interpreted as an admission of liability. That's non-negotiable. I thought about it. I would be getting my money back, and they would be changing their policies, which was really what I wanted. The written acknowledgement was more about principle, but if they were fixing the underlying issues, maybe that was enough. Not good enough, I said. I'll take the money and the policy changes, but I also want a written apology sent to all residents explaining what happened and what changes are being made. A public apology, Mr. Irving, that's unreasonable. No. What's unreasonable is towing people's cars without proper notice and then refusing to take responsibility. If Patricia Henderson and the board aren't willing to admit they made a mistake, even in the most general terms, then they haven't learned anything and they'll just do this to someone else in the future. I'll have to discuss this with my client. You do that. Court date is in 2 weeks. Another week went by. I spent time preparing my presentation for court, organizing all my evidence, and even doing a practice run in front of my bathroom mirror. I wanted to be ready in case the settlement fell through. Then, with just 1 week before the court date, I received a certified letter from Richard Green's office. Inside was a check for $358 covering all my costs, a confirmation that my email had been corrected, and a draft of a letter that would be sent to all residents. I read the letter carefully. Dear Meadowbrook Heights residents, on January 14th, the HOA board implemented an emergency parking ban due to snow removal needs. We have been informed that some residents did not receive adequate notice of this ban, resulting in vehicles being towed. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience or expense this may have caused. Going forward, emergency parking bans will require a minimum of 24 hours notice, and we will ensure multiple methods of communication are used to reach all residents. If you believe your vehicle was improperly towed during this incident, please contact the management office. Sincerely, the Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board. It wasn't perfect. It didn't explicitly name me or admit fault in quite the way I had wanted. But it was an apology, it was public, and it would result in better policies for everyone in the community. I called Richard Green. I'll accept the settlement on one condition. The letter needs to include information about how residents who were affected can get reimbursed. I believe that's already stated they can contact the management office. It needs to be more specific. It should say that the HOA will reimburse reasonable towing and associated costs for anyone who was towed during that incident. There was a long sigh on the other end of the line. Fine. I'll add that language. Then we have a deal. Draft up the settlement agreement and I'll sign it. The settlement agreement arrived via email the next day. I read through it carefully, checking every clause and provision. Everything we had discussed was there in legal language. I signed it, scanned it, and sent it back. Then I went to the courthouse and filed a dismissal of my small claims case. I deposited the check the same day, watching my account balance increase by $358. It felt like a victory, even if it was a small one. I wasn't trying to get rich or destroy the HOA. I just wanted them to acknowledge what they had done wrong and make it right. The letter went out to all residents the following week. I found mine in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, along with several other pieces of mail. I read it again, feeling satisfied. My phone rang that evening while I was making dinner. It was the older man who had congratulated me at the board meeting. "Michael, it's Tom Chen from Unit 18. I just wanted to thank you for what you did." My wife's car was also towed that day and we paid $300 to get it back. We were going to just eat the cost, but after getting this letter, we contacted the management office and they're sending us a check. "That's great, Tom. I'm glad it worked out." "You did a good thing, standing up to them. Patricia Henderson has ruled this community like a dictator for too long. Maybe this will make her think twice before pulling something like this again." We chatted for a few more minutes before hanging up. Over the next few days, I heard from several other neighbors with similar stories. At least 5 other cars had been towed that day, and now they were all getting reimbursed. It turned out that what I thought was just my problem had actually affected a significant portion of the community. 2 months passed, and things returned to normal. Winter turned to early spring, the snow melted, and I didn't have any further interactions with the HOA beyond paying my regular monthly fees. I thought the whole incident was behind me. Then I came home from a grocery run on a Saturday afternoon in mid-March to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, informing me that I was in violation of community standards for having an unapproved door decoration, and that I had 72 hours to remedy the violation or face a $50 fine. I stared at the notice in confusion. I didn't have any door decorations. My front door was plain and simple, just like the day I moved in. I looked at it carefully, examining every inch, and finally noticed what they were talking about. A small wreath that had been hanging there for exactly 3 days. It was maybe 10 inches in diameter, made of artificial spring flowers, and I had bought it at Target on impulse, because I thought it looked nice and welcoming. The notice cited Section 7.4 of the Community Guidelines, which stated that door decorations must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before installation. I had never heard of such a rule, and when I pulled up the guidelines online, I found that this particular section had been added just 2 weeks earlier at a board meeting I hadn't attended. I took the wreath down immediately, not because I thought I was wrong, but because I didn't want to deal with a fight over something so trivial. But the pettiness of it bothered me. The timing was suspicious. I had embarrassed Patricia Henderson and the board, forced them to issue a public apology and pay out money to multiple residents. Now they were looking for any excuse to retaliate. I decided to go to the next board meeting, just to observe and make my presence known. It was held 3 weeks later, again in the community clubhouse. This time the room was more crowded, probably 25 or 30 residents, many of whom I recognized from the towing incident. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through the usual business items. Then she brought up new fines and violations. She read off a list of addresses and alleged violations: lawn not mowed to proper height, garbage cans visible from the street, unauthorized parking of a commercial vehicle, and several others. The amounts ranged from $25 to $100. An elderly woman near the front raised her hand. "I don't understand. My lawn was cited for being 4 inches tall, but the guidelines say the maximum is 5 inches. Patricia didn't even look up from her notes. The guidelines were updated last month. The new maximum is 3 inches. But I didn't know about that. How was I supposed to know? All guideline updates are posted on the community website as always. I don't have a computer." "Then you need to make arrangements to stay informed, perhaps by asking a neighbor or family member to check for you." I stood up, unable to stay quiet. "Patricia, how many of these violations are for guidelines that were recently changed?" She looked at me with barely concealed annoyance. "Mr. Irving, how nice of you to join us." Several of the guidelines have been updated recently to maintain community standards. And how were residents notified of these changes? Through our standard procedures: website posting and email. The same procedures that you acknowledged were inadequate back in January. The room went silent. Patricia's jaw tightened. That was a different situation involving emergency notification. Routine guideline updates don't require the same level of notification. According to the HOA bylaws, any changes to community guidelines require a vote by the board and notification to all residents at least 15 days in advance of taking effect. I had done my homework. When was the vote on these changes and when were residents notified? Frank Walters cleared his throat. The changes were voted on at last month's board meeting. And when were residents notified? The minutes were posted on the website the next day. Minutes buried on a website that most residents never look at don't constitute proper notification. I looked around the room at the other residents, many of whom were nodding. "Patricia, it seems like the board is using obscure guideline changes to generate fines without properly informing residents. That's not just unfair, it's a violation of the HOA's own bylaws." Patricia stood up, her face flushed. "Mr. Irving, you are out of order. This is not your time to speak." Actually, under the bylaws, any resident can raise a point of order regarding board procedures at any time. That's Section 3.2 if you want to check. Susan Morrison whispered something to Patricia, showing her phone. Patricia glanced at it and her expression darkened further. "The board will take your concerns under advisement," she said icily. "Now, if there's no further business, this meeting is adjourned." "Wait." Tom Chen stood up from the back. "I move that the board provides printed notification of all guideline changes to be delivered to each residence, and that any fines issued for violations of changes made without proper notification be rescinded." "I second that motion," someone else called out. Patricia looked flustered. We can't just, this isn't how these meetings work." "Actually, it is," I said. "Any homeowner can make a motion at a board meeting. The board is required to vote on it." "This is ridiculous," Patricia said, but Frank was already raising his hand. "I vote yes on the motion," he said quietly. Susan looked between Patricia and Frank, then reluctantly raised her hand as well. Patricia was outvoted. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "The motion passes." Meeting adjourned. She gathered her things and stormed out of the clubhouse, leaving Frank and Susan to deal with the crowd of residents who had questions. I stayed for a while, talking to neighbors and exchanging contact information. It was becoming clear that Patricia's reign over the HOA was starting to crumble, and that there were a lot of people who were fed up with her tactics. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving calls and emails from neighbors asking for advice on various HOA disputes. I helped where I could, providing information about the bylaws and state laws, explaining how to document issues and file complaints. A small coalition of concerned residents formed, meeting informally to discuss ways to reform the HOA. In May, there was an election for board positions. All 3 current board members were up for re-election. Tom Chen decided to run along with 2 other neighbors, Jennifer Park, a lawyer who worked in environmental law, and Marcus Thompson, a retired teacher. I agreed to run as well, figuring that if I was going to spend this much time dealing with HOA issues, I might as well have an official role. The election was contested, and sometimes ugly. Patricia sent out multiple mailings warning that the new candidates would bankrupt the HOA with poor financial management and lack of experience. She held a meet and greet at her home that I heard was more of a bashing session against the challengers. But the tide had turned. Too many residents had been burned by the arbitrary enforcement and sudden rule changes. When the votes were counted, all 4 of us won seats on the expanded 5-person board. Patricia came in last place and was out. Frank Walters chose not to run again, and Susan Morrison lost to Jennifer Park by a significant margin. The only holdover from the old board was a quiet guy named Edward Kim, who mostly handled the finances and hadn't been involved in the controversial decisions. Our first meeting as the new board was surreal. We met in the same clubhouse where I had fought with Patricia just months earlier, but now I was sitting at the table instead of in the audience. We elected Jennifer as president, Tom as vice president, and I took on the role of secretary. Marcus became the head of the Architectural Review Committee, and Edward continued managing finances as treasurer. One of our first actions was to review all the fines that had been issued over the past 6 months. We found dozens that were for violations of guidelines that had been changed without proper notification. We rescinded all of them and sent refund checks where fines had been paid. We also implemented a new notification system that included email, physical mail, and a monthly newsletter delivered to every home. We revised the architectural review guidelines to be more reasonable and less arbitrary. Spring wreaths were now allowed, along with a variety of seasonal decorations within reasonable size limits. We changed the lawn height requirement back to 5 inches and clarified other vague rules that had been used as gotcha mechanisms. In July, I was at home working on a presentation for my actual job when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was spam, but something made me pick up. "Is this Michael Irving?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "Mr. Irving, my name is Carol Brennan. I'm a reporter with the Boulder Daily Camera. I'm working on a story about HOA reform and governance issues, and your name has come up several times in my research. Would you be willing to speak with me?" I hesitated. I wasn't looking for publicity or attention. I had just wanted to resolve my own problem and maybe help my neighbors. But if talking to a reporter could help raise awareness about HOA issues and maybe help people in other communities, maybe it was worth doing. "What would you want to talk about?" I asked. "I'd like to hear about your experience with Meadowbrook Heights HOA, the towing incident, the small claims case, and the recent board election. I'm looking at patterns of HOA overreach and what can be done about it." We ended up meeting for coffee the next day at a place downtown. Carol was in her 40s, professional and sharp, with a notebook full of questions. I told her the whole story, from waking up to find my car gone to sitting on the board and implementing reforms. She took detailed notes and asked smart follow-up questions. "What would you say to other homeowners who are dealing with similar issues with their HOAs?" she asked near the end of our conversation. "Document everything, I said. Keep records, take photos, save emails. Know your rights under state law and your HOA's own bylaws. A lot of HOAs count on residents being too intimidated or too busy to fight back. But if you're willing to stand up for yourself and follow through, you can make a difference. I never thought I'd end up on an HOA board or become some kind of advocate for reform. I just wanted my $300 back. But sometimes when you stand up for yourself, you end up standing up for other people too. The article ran 2 weeks later on the front page of the local section. It was a fair and thorough piece that told my story along with similar stories from other communities in the Boulder area. Carol had interviewed legal experts who explained HOA law and residents' rights. She included statistics about the rising number of HOA complaints filed with the state and quotes from legislators who were considering reforms to HOA governance laws. The day after the article came out, I got a phone call from Richard Green, the lawyer who had represented the HOA during my small claims case. Michael, hi. I read the article in the camera. Interesting piece. Thanks, I guess. I'm actually calling because I wanted to apologize. When I took on the HOA as a client, I didn't realize the extent of the issues. I was just looking at your case in isolation and trying to minimize my client's liability. After reading about everything that happened subsequently, I realized that the board was engaging in a pattern of behavior that was really problematic. I was surprised. I appreciate you saying that. I've actually dropped them as a client. I sent Patricia Henderson a letter last month ending our representation. I don't want to be associated with that kind of governance. Well, Patricia's not on the board anymore, so there's that. I heard. That's good. Listen, if you or the new board ever need legal advice on HOA matters, I'd be happy to help at a reduced rate. Consider it my way of making amends. I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Richard. After we hung up, I sat for a moment thinking about how strange the whole journey had been. 10 months earlier, I had been a regular guy living a quiet life. And now I was an HOA board member, a subject of newspaper articles, and apparently something of a local advocate for homeowners' rights. In August, I got an even more unexpected call. It was from the office of a state representative named Barbara Chen who served our district. Mr. Irving, Representative Chen, read about your experience and the reforms you've been implementing at Meadowbrook Heights. She's working on legislation to strengthen homeowner protections in HOA disputes, and she'd like to speak with you about testifying at a committee hearing. 2 weeks later, I found myself at the state capitol in Denver, sitting at a table in front of a committee of legislators, telling my story once again. This time it was more formal, more official, and the stakes felt higher. I talked about the towing incident, the lack of proper notice, the retaliation through arbitrary fines, and the difficulty of holding HOA boards accountable. Other people testified too. A woman from Colorado Springs talked about how her HOA had put a lien on her house over a disputed fine of $50, nearly causing her to lose her home. A man from Fort Collins described how his HOA had banned him from attending meetings after he raised questions about financial irregularities. An elderly couple from Pueblo explained how they had been fined thousands of dollars for yard violations they couldn't physically fix due to their age and health issues. The proposed legislation, if passed, would require HOAs to provide multiple forms of notification for rule changes, limit the amount of fines that could be imposed without due process, create a state office to handle HOA complaints, and make it easier for homeowners to challenge HOA actions in court. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The bill ended up passing in modified form the following spring, I watched the vote online from my living room, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. Something that had started with a personal dispute over a towed car had turned into actual legal reform that would help thousands of people. Back at Meadowbrook Heights, life was surprisingly good. The new board was functioning well, making decisions collaboratively and transparently. We held regular town halls where residents could ask questions and raise concerns. We published detailed financial reports so everyone knew where their HOA fees were going. We treated people like adults who deserved respect rather than children who needed to be controlled. There was still the occasional dispute. Someone complained about a neighbor's wind chimes being too loud. Someone else wanted to install solar panels but was worried about the approval process. A resident wanted to run a small business from their home and needed clarification on the rules. But we handled these things reasonably, working with people to find solutions rather than looking for reasons to say no or impose fines. In October, about 10 months after the election, I ran into Patricia Henderson at the grocery store. It was the first time I had seen her since she left the board. She looked older, more tired. I nodded politely and started to push my cart past her, but she stopped me. "Michael," she said, "can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure," I said, surprised. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to say that I'm sorry. For the towing, for the retaliation with the wreath, for all of it. I got too caught up in the power of being board president. I started seeing residents as problems to manage rather than neighbors to serve. You were right to challenge me, and I was wrong to fight you on it." I didn't know what to say. An apology was the last thing I expected from her. "Thank you for saying that, Patricia. I appreciate it. I heard about the legislation you helped pass. That's good work. You've done more good for this community in 1 year than I did in 5. "I don't know about that. You kept things running for a long time. I kept things controlled. That's different from keeping them running well." She paused, looking down at her shopping cart. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know that I realize I was wrong. I hope the community continues to improve under the new board." We parted ways and I continued my shopping, thinking about the apology. It took courage to admit fault, especially for someone like Patricia who had built her identity around being in charge and being right. Maybe people could change after all. By the time the first anniversary of the towing incident rolled around in January, Meadowbrook Heights felt like a genuinely different place. Neighbors were friendlier. There was more trust in the board, and the constant undercurrent of anxiety about arbitrary rules and fines had dissipated. At our January board meeting, Jennifer suggested we do something to commemorate the changes that had happened over the past year. "What if we have a community gathering?" she proposed. "Nothing fancy, just a chance for everyone to get together, have some food, and celebrate how far we've come." We all agreed it was a good idea. We planned it for a Saturday in late January, weather permitting, and sent out invitations to all residents. We set up tables in the clubhouse with potluck food, made a slideshow showing some of the improvements we had made to the common areas with HOA funds, and Jennifer prepared a short speech thanking everyone for their participation and support. The turnout was incredible. Nearly 100 people showed up, representing about 70% of the homes in the community. People brought dishes to share. Kids ran around playing games, and there was a warmth and sense of community that I had never felt before at Meadowbrook Heights. During the informal program, Jennifer invited me to say a few words. I hadn't prepared anything, so I just spoke from the heart. A year ago, I woke up to find my car had been towed from my parking spot. I was angry and frustrated, and I almost just paid the fine and moved on. But something made me decide to fight back, not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because what happened wasn't right and I knew it. What I didn't know was that standing up for myself would lead to all of this. I gestured around the room at the gathered neighbors. This community is stronger now because people were willing to get involved, to run for the board, to speak up at meetings, to hold leadership accountable. That's not about me. That's about all of us deciding that we deserve better and being willing to work for it. So thank you to everyone here for making Meadowbrook Heights a real community, and not just a collection of houses with a bunch of rules. People applauded, and we moved on to eating and socializing. I spent the afternoon talking to neighbors I had never really met before, hearing their stories and their ideas for the community. Tom Chen pulled me aside at one point with a big grin on his face. "Remember when you stood up at that board meeting and quoted the bylaws at Patricia? That was the moment I knew things were going to change. You gave people permission to fight back." "I was just trying to get my $300 back," I said with a laugh. "Maybe that's what makes it so powerful. You weren't trying to be a hero or lead a revolution. You were just standing up for yourself, and that inspired everyone else to do the same." As the gathering wound down and people started heading home, I helped clean up the clubhouse with the other board members. We worked together efficiently, packing up leftover food, breaking down tables, and wiping down surfaces. It felt good to be part of a team that actually functioned well and cared about doing the right thing. When everything was cleaned up and we were about to lock up the clubhouse, Marcus paused at the door and looked back at the empty room. "You know what's funny?" he said. "This is the same room where we used to dread coming to board meetings because Patricia would be here ready to lecture and fine everyone. Now it feels completely different. Same space, totally different energy." "That's because it's not about the space," Jennifer said. "It's about the people and how they treat each other." We locked up and headed to our respective homes. As I walked across the parking lot to my townhouse, I passed my designated parking spot, number 42, where my car was safely parked. I thought about that morning a year ago when the spot had been empty and everything that had happened since then. The stress, the confrontations, the small claims court preparation, the election, the board work, the legislation, all of it. If someone had told me back then that having my car towed would lead to all of this, I never would have believed them. But life is funny that way. Sometimes the worst moments become catalysts for the best changes. Sometimes standing up for yourself ends up making things better for everyone. And sometimes a $300 towing fee turns into a community transformation. I went inside my townhouse, made myself dinner, and settled in for a quiet evening. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer about an upcoming board meeting agenda item, and I responded quickly before setting the phone aside. I had come a long way from the guy who just wanted to be left alone and not cause any trouble. I had learned that sometimes trouble is necessary, that sometimes conflict leads to growth, and that communities are built by people who care enough to fight for what's right. The next morning, Sunday, I was drinking coffee and reading the news when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman in her early 30s standing there with a folder in her hand. "Are you Michael Irving?" she asked. "Yes, can I help you? My name is Olivia Lewis. I live in the Sagebrush Commons development on the other side of Boulder. I read about what you did here at Meadowbrook Heights, and I'm dealing with a similar situation with our HOA. They towed my car last week for parking in a guest spot overnight, even though there's nothing in our CC and Articus that says residents can't use guest spots. They're charging me $400 to get it back and refusing to discuss it. I was hoping maybe you could give me some advice." I invited her in, and we sat at my kitchen table. She showed me her HOA documents, the towing notice, and the correspondence she had had with her board. It was eerily similar to my own situation from a year earlier. Different details, same pattern of overreach and unwillingness to admit fault. First thing you need to do is document everything, I told her. Take photos, save emails, get copies of any relevant rules or bylaws. Then you need to formally request a hearing with the board. Put it in writing and send it certified mail. We spent an hour going through her situation, and I shared everything I had learned. I gave her copies of the state statutes I had used, explained the small claims court process, and connected her with Richard Green in case she needed legal advice. By the time she left, she seemed more confident and prepared to fight. Over the next few months, I helped several other people from other HOA communities with similar issues. Word had spread, apparently, that I was someone who knew how to deal with HOA problems. I never charged anyone anything, and I never spent more time than I could afford, but I tried to help where I could. Some people ended up winning their disputes, others settled, and a few decided the fight wasn't worth it and paid the fines. But everyone appreciated having someone who understood what they were going through and could offer guidance. In April, I got a surprise email from Olivia Lewis with an attachment. I opened it to find a photo of her holding a check from her HOA for $400. The subject line read, "We won, thank you." I replied with congratulations, and she wrote back, "I could never have done this without your help. You literally saved me $400 and showed me how to stand up for myself. I've decided to run for our HOA board in the next election. If you could do it, so can I." That made me smile. The ripples kept spreading. By summer, life had settled into a comfortable routine. I was doing well at my regular job, the HOA board was running smoothly, and I was still occasionally helping people with their HOA disputes on the side. I had even started dating someone I met at a coffee shop, a teacher named Rebecca who thought my HOA reform work was either admirable or crazy depending on the day. In August, I got a formal letter in the mail from the Colorado State Legislature. I opened it expecting maybe another request to testify about HOA issues, but instead, it was something completely unexpected. It was a certificate of recognition for outstanding community leadership and advocacy for homeowners' rights, signed by multiple state representatives and senators, including Representative Barbara Chen. I hung the certificate on my wall, not out of ego, but as a reminder. A reminder that ordinary people can make extraordinary changes when they're willing to stand up for what's right. A reminder that justice sometimes requires fighting for it. A reminder that community matters and is worth protecting. On the 2-year anniversary of the towing incident, I was at an HOA board meeting when Tom Chen brought up an interesting idea during new business. "I've been thinking," he said. "What if we established a community fund to help residents who are dealing with HOA disputes? Not just here, but anywhere in Boulder County. We could use some of our reserve funds to seed it and maybe set up a nonprofit. Michael has been helping people informally for over a year now. What if we formalized it and expanded it?" We discussed the idea at length. There were legal and practical considerations, questions about liability and scope. But the more we talked about it, the more sense it made. HOA disputes disproportionately affected people who couldn't afford lawyers, who didn't have time to research laws and file court papers, who didn't have the confidence or knowledge to fight back. A community fund that provided resources, advice, and sometimes financial support for legitimate cases could make a real difference. We formed a committee to explore the idea further, and by the end of the year, the Boulder County HOA Justice Fund was officially established as a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization. I served on the board of directors along with Tom, Jennifer, and several other people from around the county who had experience with HOA issues. We raised money through small donations from community members and a few larger grants from foundations interested in housing justice. The fund started small, helping maybe 1 or 2 people a month with advice or small amounts of financial support for filing fees and such. But it grew steadily as word spread. We developed educational materials about HOA rights, created template letters for common disputes, and built a network of volunteer lawyers who would provide pro bono consultations. 3 years after my car was towed, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA governance in Phoenix. I flew down for the weekend and gave a presentation about grassroots reform and resident empowerment. The room was packed with people from all over the country who were dealing with similar issues in their communities. I told my story for what felt like the 100th time, but it never got old because every time I told it, someone in the audience would come up afterward and say, "That's exactly what happened to me," or "You've inspired me to run for my board," or "I'm going to fight my HOA now instead of giving up." The conference organizers gave me a small honorarium for speaking, which I donated to the HOA Justice Fund. I didn't do this work for money or recognition. I did it because it mattered, because I had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and I felt obligated to take it. On the flight home, I thought about everything that had changed since that snowy morning in January 4 years earlier. My entire life had shifted in directions I never could have predicted. I had become an advocate, a community leader, a public speaker. I had helped dozens of people resolve disputes with their HOAs. I had contributed to legal reform at the state level. I had helped establish a nonprofit that would continue helping people long after I was no longer involved. And it all started because I refused to accept an unjust $300 charge. When I got back to Boulder, Rebecca picked me up from the airport. We had been together for almost 3 years at that point, and had recently moved in together into a house we bought outside of any HOA jurisdiction. No more Meadowbrook Heights for me, though I still served on the board remotely since the bylaws didn't require board members to be current residents, just property owners, and I still owned my townhouse, which I now rented out. "How was the conference?" Rebecca asked as we drove home. "Good." Exhausting but good. I met a lot of amazing people doing similar work in their communities. "Did you tell the car towing story?" "Of course. It's the origin story. Can't leave that out," she laughed. "You're like a superhero, except instead of fighting crime, you fight HOA overreach." That's definitely less glamorous, but probably more useful for the average person. We stopped for dinner at our favorite Thai place, and I told her about the conference, the people I had met, and the ideas I had picked up. She was always supportive of my HOA work, even when it took up time we could have spent together. She understood that it was important to me and that it helped people. "You know what I think is so great about what you've done?" she said as we were finishing our meal. "You could have taken your settlement and moved on. You got your money back, you got your apology, you even got on the board and fixed the problems. But you didn't stop there. You kept going, kept helping other people, kept pushing for bigger changes. That's real impact." "I don't know if I had a choice," I said. "Once I started helping people, I couldn't just stop. There were too many people who needed help, and I had the knowledge to provide it. That's what makes it meaningful. You could have stopped, but you didn't." The next day, Monday, I was back at my regular job, attending meetings and working on projects. My colleagues knew about my HOA advocacy work, but it rarely came up. I was just another guy in the office, dealing with deadlines and deliverables. It was almost strange to switch between these two worlds, The normal working world where I was just Michael, the project manager, and the advocacy world where I was Michael, the HOA reform guy. Around mid-afternoon, I got a call from Jennifer. "Hey Michael, are you sitting down?" "Yeah, what's up?" "You know that lawsuit Patricia Henderson filed against the HOA board, claiming we unlawfully removed her from power?" I had almost forgotten about that. Patricia had filed suit about 6 months after losing the election, claiming that the election had been rigged or improperly conducted or something equally baseless. It had been a nuisance case, clearly filed out of spite, but we had had to respond to it and hire a lawyer to defend the board. "What about it?" I asked. "The judge just dismissed it with prejudice. Not only did we win, but the judge sanctioned Patricia and her lawyer for filing a frivolous lawsuit. She has to pay our legal fees, which are about $25,000. I let out a long breath. Wow, that's huge. The judge's order is scathing. He basically says that Patricia abused the legal system to pursue a personal vendetta, and that her claims had no basis in law or fact. He also noted the pattern of behavior you testified about during the discovery process. I had been deposed for the case a few months earlier and had spent 3 hours answering questions about the towing incident, the retaliation, and Patricia's tenure on the board. It had been uncomfortable but necessary. "So it's finally over?" I asked. "It's finally over. Patricia can't run for the board again. She can't file any more lawsuits about this, and she owes us a ton of money. Complete victory." We talked for a few more minutes about the details and then hung up. I sat at my desk feeling a sense of closure. The lawsuit had been hanging over us for months, a reminder that Patricia was still out there trying to cause problems. Now that chapter was definitively closed. That evening, I told Rebecca about the lawsuit dismissal over dinner. "I almost feel bad for her," Rebecca said. "I mean, she did terrible things as HOA president, but now she's lost her position, her reputation, and she owes $25,000. That's a pretty complete downfall." "She brought it on herself," I said. "She could have lost the election and moved on with her life. Instead, she filed a baseless lawsuit trying to overturn the results. That was her choice." "True, but still, it's kind of sad. She built her whole identity around being the HOA president, and now she has nothing." I thought about that. Rebecca was more empathetic than I was, always able to see things from other people's perspectives. "Maybe it'll be good for her in the long run," I said. "Maybe hitting rock bottom will force her to reevaluate and become a better person. Like what happened after I ran into her at the grocery store and she apologized." "Maybe," Rebecca said. "People can change if they want to." A few weeks later, in late September, I was at home on a Saturday morning when I got a call from an unknown Denver number. I answered cautiously. "Is this Michael Irving?" "Yes, who's calling?" "Mr. Irving, my name is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling about Patricia Henderson. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" My stomach dropped. "Is Patricia okay? Did something happen to her, Mrs. Henderson is fine, physically. But she's been arrested and we're investigating allegations of financial crimes related to her time as HOA president at Meadowbrook Heights. Your name has come up in our investigation, and I'd like to ask you some questions." I sat down heavily on my couch. "Financial crimes? What kind of financial crimes?" "I can't get into specifics over the phone, but we believe Mrs. Henderson may have embezzled HOA funds during her tenure. We're interviewing current and former board members and residents." "Would you be willing to come to our office for a formal interview?" "Of course, absolutely." "When do you need me?" We scheduled an interview for the following Tuesday. I called Jennifer immediately after hanging up with the detective. "Jennifer, did you just get a call from the CBI about Patricia?" Yes, about 20 minutes ago. Michael, this is insane. They think she was stealing HOA money, that's what the detective said. Did you notice anything in the financial records when we took over the board? Not really, but I wasn't looking for embezzlement. Edward handled most of the finances, and he said everything looked normal. But if Patricia was smart about it, she could have hidden it in ways that wouldn't be obvious without a forensic audit. We talked for a while longer, speculating about what might have happened and how it might have been discovered. Jennifer promised to call Edward and Tom to see if they had gotten similar calls. The following Tuesday, I drove to the CBI office in Denver for my interview. Detective Martinez was a professional woman in her 40s with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She led me to a small interview room and turned on a recording device after I signed some paperwork. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Irving. As I mentioned on the phone, we're investigating allegations that Patricia Henderson embezzled funds from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA during her time as president. Based on our initial analysis, we believe she took approximately $90,000 over a 5-year period." I let out a low whistle. 90,000. How? Various methods. Fake vendor invoices, inflated repair bills with kickbacks, diverting funds meant for community improvements into personal accounts. She was fairly sophisticated about it. How did you find out about it? We received an anonymous tip about 6 weeks ago. The tipster provided specific details about suspicious transactions. We opened an investigation and brought in a forensic accountant to review the HOA's records. The evidence is pretty clear. Detective Martinez asked me questions for about 90 minutes. What was my experience with Patricia as HOA president? Did I ever notice any financial irregularities? Did I have any reason to suspect she was misusing funds? I answered as honestly as I could, describing the towing incident, the retaliation, and the overall pattern of behavior that had led to her removal from the board. "Based on what you've described," Detective Martinez said, "Mrs. Henderson seemed to view the HOA as her personal fiefdom. The embezzlement fits that pattern. She felt entitled to the money because she was doing the work." "What happens now?" I asked. "We've arrested her and charged her with theft, embezzlement, and fraud. She's out on bail. The case will go to trial unless she accepts a plea deal. Given the amount of money involved and the duration of the scheme, she's looking at significant prison time if convicted." I left the interview feeling shaken. Embezzlement was a whole different level than being a petty tyrant or filing a frivolous lawsuit. This was serious criminal activity that had victimized the entire community. $90,000 that could have been used for community improvements or reducing HOA fees had instead gone into Patricia's pocket. The news broke publicly a few days later when a reporter got wind of the arrest and wrote a story for the Denver Post. The headline was, "Former HOA President Arrested for Embezzling $90,000 from Boulder Community." The article detailed Patricia's arrest, the charges against her, and included background about her controversial tenure and the reforms that had been implemented after she left office. The story quoted me briefly, mostly about the reforms we had made after I joined the board. But it also mentioned the towing incident and the small claims case, connecting the dots between Patricia's abuse of power and her criminal activity. The reaction in the Meadowbrook Heights community was a mix of shock and vindication. People couldn't believe that Patricia had actually stolen money, but at the same time, it explained a lot. It explained why she had been so aggressive about fines and fees, because she was skimming money and needed the revenue to cover it up. It explained why she had been so resistant to transparency, because transparency would have exposed her scheme. The HOA held an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. We brought in a lawyer to explain our options and a forensic accountant to walk through the details of what Patricia had done. The community voted unanimously to cooperate fully with the criminal prosecution and to file a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. Over the next several months, the case wound its way through the legal system. Patricia's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution wasn't interested in being lenient given the amount of money and the duration of the scheme. In February, almost a year after my conversation with Detective Martinez, the case went to trial. I was called to testify, not about the financial crimes specifically, but about Patricia's behavior and character as HOA president. I described the towing incident, her refusal to admit any wrongdoing, the retaliation through arbitrary fines, and her general attitude of being above the rules. Would you say Mrs. Henderson viewed herself as entitled to make unilateral decisions without accountability? The prosecutor asked. Absolutely, I said. She acted like the HOA existed to serve her, not the other way around. The trial lasted a week. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountant laid out the scheme in detail, showing fake invoices, altered records, and money transfers into Patricia's personal accounts. The prosecution presented testimony from contractors who had been asked to inflate their bills and give Patricia kickbacks. They showed how she had gradually escalated from small amounts to larger thefts, as she gained confidence that she wouldn't get caught. Patricia's defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to argue that the financial records were confusing and that any errors were unintentional, but the prosecution demonstrated clear intent and planning. Patricia herself didn't testify, which I thought was probably the right call because she would have been destroyed on cross-examination. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia stood stoically as the verdicts were read, showing no emotion. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later. I attended the sentencing hearing along with several other members of the HOA board and community. The judge heard victim impact statements from residents who talked about how the theft had affected them and the community. Jennifer, as current HOA president, delivered a statement about the breach of trust and the damage to community cohesion. Then the judge spoke. He was a stern-looking man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of cases, but still seemed personally offended by this one. Mrs. Henderson, you were in a position of trust. Your neighbors elected you to manage their community and their money. Instead of honoring that trust, you betrayed it for personal gain. You stole $90,000 over 5 years, money that belonged to hardworking people who entrusted you with it. You have shown no remorse and no acceptance of responsibility. The law provides for significant penalties in cases like this, and I intend to apply them. I sentence you to 6 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of $90,000 plus interest to the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. Finally, you are permanently barred from serving in any fiduciary capacity for any homeowners association in the state of Colorado. Patricia was taken into custody immediately. As the bailiff led her out of the courtroom, she glanced back at the gallery where we were sitting. Our eyes met for just a moment. I couldn't read her expression. Regret, defiance, resignation. Maybe all three. We filed out of the courthouse into the bright March sunshine. Jennifer turned to me and said, "It's really over now. Everything." "Yeah," I said. "It's over." We went out for lunch, the board members and a few community members, and talked about everything except Patricia and the trial. We talked about upcoming improvements to the community, about the summer block party we were planning, about normal HOA business. It felt good to finally move past the drama and focus on building something positive. The restitution from Patricia's sentencing, combined with the civil lawsuit recovery, ended up bringing back about 60,000 of the 90,000 she had stolen. The rest was probably gone forever, spent on who knows what during her 5-year scheme. But the HOA was in decent financial shape, and we were able to absorb the loss without raising fees. In May, almost 4 years to the day after the board election that removed Patricia from power, I decided to step down from the HOA board. It was time. I had accomplished what I set out to do and more. The community was healthy, the board was functioning well, and there were new people ready to step up and serve. I was also getting busier with the HOA Justice Fund work, and something had to give. At my final board meeting, the community threw me a small surprise party. There was cake, there were speeches, and Jennifer presented me with a plaque that read, "Michael Irving, for extraordinary service to the Meadowbrook Heights community, and for never backing down from standing up for what's right." I give a short speech thanking everyone and reflecting on the journey. 4.5 years ago, my car got towed and I got mad. That's really how all of this started, just one guy being mad about an injustice. But that one moment of anger turned into action, and that action turned into change, and that change rippled out far beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm proud of what we've accomplished here. We took a dysfunctional, sometimes toxic community and turned it into a place where people actually want to live and feel like they have a voice. That's not because of me. That's because of all of you who cared enough to get involved and do the work. Thank you for letting me be part of it. People applauded and we ate cake and talked for a couple hours. As I was leaving, Tom Chen pulled me aside one last time. "You changed my life, you know," he said. "Before you stood up to Patricia at that meeting, I was just a guy who kept his head down and paid his fees and tried not to cause trouble. You showed me that ordinary people can fight back and win. I've been more engaged in my community, more willing to speak up about things that matter." "That's because of you. You would have gotten there eventually," I said. "I just maybe sped things up a bit. Don't sell yourself short. What you did mattered. It still matters." We shook hands and I drove home, feeling both nostalgic and relieved. A chapter of my life was ending, but it had been a good chapter, one I was proud of. The HOA Justice Fund continued to grow and help people across Boulder County and eventually across Colorado. We expanded our services, hired a part-time coordinator, and developed partnerships with legal aid organizations. In the first 3 years, we helped more than 200 people resolve HOA disputes, recovered over $400,000 in unjust fees and fines, and contributed to several more pieces of reform legislation. Rebecca and I got married in a small ceremony in the mountains with close friends and family. No HOA drama, no community politics, just two people who loved each other starting a new phase of life together. Tom and his wife came, Jennifer and her partner came, even Richard Green came, the lawyer who had defended the HOA against me and then became an ally. At the reception, during the toasts, Tom stood up with his glass raised and told the whole story to our assembled guests. The towing, the small claims case, the board election, Patricia's downfall, everything. People laughed at the funny parts and shook their heads at the outrageous parts and applauded at the end. "So here's to Michael," Tom said in conclusion. "A man who wouldn't accept an injustice and who ended up changing an entire community because of it. And to Rebecca, for loving a man whose idea of fighting the system is reading HOA bylaws." Everyone laughed and drank and the party continued. Later that evening, as Rebecca and I danced to our first song as a married couple, she whispered in my ear, "I'm proud of you, for everything you've done, for standing up when it mattered." "I'm just glad I did something that made a difference," I whispered back. "You made more than a difference. You made a whole new world for a lot of people." Now, looking back on all of it from the comfortable distance of several years, I can see how unlikely the whole thing was. I was never supposed to be an HOA reformer or a community advocate. I was just a regular guy who wanted to live his life in peace. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes a single moment of injustice becomes a catalyst for massive change. Sometimes refusing to accept no opens doors you didn't know existed. The towing of my car was wrong. The HOA's refusal to make it right was wrong. But my response, my decision to fight back, to document everything, to follow through even when it would have been easier to give up, that was right. And it led to Patricia being held accountable, to better laws protecting homeowners, to hundreds of people getting help with their own disputes, to a community transformed. I still live in Boulder with Rebecca. We have a nice house with a yard and no HOA, which suits me just fine. I still work my regular job managing projects for a tech company. I still volunteer with the HOA Justice Fund, though less actively now that it's well established and has good leadership. I'm just a guy living a normal life. But sometimes I'll be at the grocery store or the coffee shop or just walking down the street, and someone will recognize me. "Hey, aren't you that guy who fought the HOA?" they'll ask. And I'll smile and nod, and we'll chat for a few minutes about their own HOA situation, or about how they're glad someone stood up to the system. Those moments remind me that what happened mattered. That refusing to accept injustice, even over something as small as a parking violation, can have effects that ripple outward in ways you can't predict or control. That ordinary people have more power than they think they do, if they're willing to use it. My car getting towed without proper notice was one of the worst mornings of my life at the time. Now, I see it as one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the stress or the conflict, but because it pushed me to become a better, more engaged person. It taught me that I had a voice and that using it could make a difference. So if there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple. Don't accept injustice. Document everything. Know your rights. Be willing to stand up for yourself even when it's uncomfortable. Follow through even when it's hard. Because you never know what chain of events you might set in motion. You never know who you might inspire or help. You never know how one small act of defiance might change everything. All of that from a towed car and a $300 dispute. All of that because I refused to back down. All of that because sometimes standing up for yourself is the most important thing you can do.